Welcome to Historian Ape, Episode 2, The Mongol Empire, the Horsemen Who Conquered the World. In this episode, we'll uncover how a people from the vast grasslands of Asia rose from obscurity to dominate half the known world. Their story is one of survival, strategy, and conquest, but also of a boy who would become a legend. The earth trembles, not with earthquakes, not with thunder, but with hooves, thousands of them. A black cloud of dust rises over the horizon as riders pour across the steppe like a living storm. Each rider carries a bow, small, curved, and deadly. Each horse moves as if it were an extension of its master. They ride not in chaos but in order, rows upon rows, shifting, breaking, and reforming with perfect precision. And when they strike, they vanish again, as though swallowed by the wind. These are the Mongols. To their enemies, they are not men but demons on horseback, unstoppable, merciless, and everywhere at once. Cities that resist are reduced to ashes. Kingdoms that stand against them crumble like sand. From the plains of China to the fields of Hungary, their shadow stretches across half the known world. But the story of this empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, does not begin with conquest. It begins with a boy abandoned by his tribe, betrayed by allies, hunted by enemies, and forced to survive in a land where only the strongest endure. His name was Temüjin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. And if you're ready to ride with us through this epic journey, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you even more stories of history's rise and fall. Now, picture the 12th century. While Europe staggered through the chaos of the Middle Ages, castles, crusades, and kingdoms in constant war, far to the east lay a world few Europeans had ever seen, the endless grasslands of Central Asia. It was a sea of green and gold stretching to the horizon, a land without borders, walls, kings, or crowns. Here, the horse was life. Children learned to ride before they could walk. The bow was their constant companion. Survival meant mobility, loyalty, and above all, strength. The steppe was harsh, and it bred people harsher still. This was the crucible that forged Genghis Khan. From this desolate landscape would emerge a leader who united warring tribes into a single nation. A man who took the scattered, fractious clans of Mongolia and forged them into a weapon so sharp it cut through empires. The Mongols were not just conquerors. They were innovators of war, masters of deception, terror, and psychological control. But they were also builders of trade routes, systems of communication, and a new age of global exchange. They brought both destruction and connection, devastation and opportunity. For some, their name meant annihilation. For others, prosperity. But for everyone, one truth remained. Once the Mongols arrived, nothing was ever the same again. So, how did an outcast boy rise to command the greatest army the world had ever seen? How did a people dismissed as scattered nomads sweep across continents and redraw the map of the old world? And what legacy did they leave behind? One that still echoes in the world we live in today. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, the story of the horsemen who conquered the world. Children of the steppe learned to ride before they could read or write. In fact, many never did. A Mongol boy might spend more hours on horseback than on the ground. By the age of 3, he could shoot a bow while riding at a full gallop. Horses weren't just transportation. They were survival, providing milk, meat, clothing, and even warmth at night when pressed against the body in the cold. Nomadic families lived in jurs, circular felt tents that could be dismantled in minutes, loaded onto wagons, and rebuilt somewhere else by sundown. Everything they owned was portable. Nothing was permanent. This mobility shaped their worldview. To the sedentary kingdoms of China or Persia, borders mattered. To the nomads of the steppe, borders were illusions. The land was open, endless, and theirs for the taking, so long as they were strong enough to hold it. But the steppe was not united. Far from it. It was a patchwork of clans and tribes, constantly feuding, raiding, and betraying one another. Alliances shifted like the wind. A tribe that was an ally one year might be an enemy the next. Blood feuds could last for generations. Power was fragile. Leaders ruled not through divine right or written law, but through sheer charisma and strength. If a Khan showed weakness, his followers abandoned him. In this world, loyalty was conditional, and survival meant always being prepared for betrayal. For centuries, these tribes fought among themselves, rarely uniting or posing a threat to the great empires that bordered them. To China, the Mongols were just another nuisance tribe, no different from the Huns, the Turks, or the countless waves of nomads that had harassed their borders for millennia. And yet, under the right leader, these scattered clans had the potential to become something much greater. To understand the rise of the Mongols, we need to see the bigger picture. The 12th century world was fragmented, powerful, yes, but divided. China was split between dynasties, the Jin in the north and the Song in the south, constantly at odds. The Islamic world, stretching from Persia to Central Asia, was fractured, rich in wealth but politically unstable. Europe was still in its medieval phase, a world of knights, castles, and crusades, but far too divided to pose any united front. Russia was a patchwork of city-states, endlessly fighting one another. The great powers of the time were rich, sophisticated, and heavily fortified, but they were also distracted by their own conflicts and politics. They never imagined that a force from the steppes, a place they considered barbaric and backward, would one day come crashing down upon them like a storm. What the Mongols lacked in cities, literacy, or architecture, they more than made up for with mobility and innovation. Their horses were small but incredibly hardy, able to travel 60 to 100 miles a day. A Mongol warrior often kept 3 to 5 horses and switched between them, giving them unmatched endurance. Their bows were masterpieces of engineering, short enough to fire from horseback, but powerful enough to pierce armor at over 200 yards. Their warfare was not about strength but speed, deception, and psychological terror. In a world of slow-moving armies, heavy cavalry, and fortified castles, the Mongols were something entirely new. And yet, in the late 12th century, the Mongols themselves were weak, scattered, and vulnerable. Their rivals among the tribes constantly sought to crush them. The Jin dynasty to the south treated them with disdain, more concerned with internal rivals than with nomads. The Islamic states to the west saw the steppe as irrelevant. Europe had barely even heard of Mongolia. But history often turns on the most unlikely figures. Out of this fractured, hostile world, from a clan on the brink of annihilation, a boy named Temüjin would rise. He would do the unthinkable, unite the tribes of the steppe into one nation, one army, one unstoppable force. The world was not ready. Temüjin was born in 1162, near the banks of the Anan River, in the windswept lands of northeastern Mongolia. His father, Yesuje, was a respected leader of the Borjigin clan, and his mother, Holun, was a woman of fierce determination who had once been stolen from her own people in a raid. From the very beginning, Temüjin's life was shaped by violence, betrayal, and the fragile alliances of the steppe. When he was only 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage for him to secure an alliance. The young boy was betrothed to Bort, a girl from another powerful clan. It should have secured his future. But on the return journey, Yesuje stopped among a rival tribe to share a meal. They offered him food and drink laced with poison. He staggered home, sick and weakening. Before his death, he told his son to remember Bert and to claim her when the time came. And then, suddenly, Temüjin's world collapsed. Without his father, the family lost everything. On the steppe, strength was the only currency that mattered. Without protection, Temüjin's mother and her children were cast out, abandoned by their tribe to starve. Overnight, they became outcasts. The young boy who had once been heir to leadership was reduced to digging wild roots from the frozen earth, catching fish with crude traps, and eating whatever scraps nature offered. Holun, fierce and unbroken, kept her children alive, telling them that no one would save them. They would either endure or die. It was in this crucible of hunger and isolation that Temüjin hardened. He learned early that survival demanded not only strength, but ruthlessness. Among his brothers, rivalries turned violent. One half-brother, Bektar, began to challenge his authority. The tension grew until it could not be contained. Temüjin, alongside his younger brother Kasar, struck first. They ambushed Bektar and killed him. It was a shocking act for one so young, but it was a lesson that would follow him his entire life. Power was never given, it had to be taken. His struggles only deepened. As a teenager, he was captured by a rival clan, beaten and enslaved, and forced to wear a wooden collar around his neck. He was mocked, humiliated, treated as less than human. For most, it would have broken the spirit. But one night, with the secret help of a sympathetic guard, Temüjin escaped. From that moment forward, he believed he was destined for more. If he could survive betrayal, starvation, and slavery, then perhaps the world itself could not hold him down. Even in those early years, he revealed his rare gift, the ability to inspire loyalty. While other leaders of the steppe ruled through bloodline and fear, Temüjin remembered those who stood by him, rewarding them and binding them with personal trust. His first great ally was Jamaka, a childhood friend with whom he swore a blood oath of brotherhood. For a time, they dreamed of uniting the steppe together. But dreams often shatter on the winds of ambition. When Temüjin came of age, he returned to claim Bort, fulfilling his father's dying wish. Their marriage gave him not only a loyal companion, but also crucial political ties. Bert herself would become one of his greatest strengths, wise and resilient. But their union was soon tested. Rivals raided their camp and stole Bert away. Many would have abandoned hope, but Temüjin refused. He gathered what few allies he had, struck back with relentless determination, and rescued her. Against all odds, he succeeded. It was more than a personal victory. It was a declaration to the tribes of the steppe. This man would not be broken, and those who followed him would see their loyalty repaid. But the greatest test was yet to come. His friendship with Jamaka soured as both men sought dominance. Their conflict erupted into open war. At the Battle of Dalan Baljut, Temüjin commanded 20,000 warriors, Jamaka 30,000. The clash was brutal. With arrows darkening the sky and cavalry charges, slamming into one another with thunderous force. Temüjin's men fought with discipline, but in the end, Jamaka's larger force prevailed. 70 of Temüjin's captured warriors were executed in the most horrific manner imaginable, boiled alive in cauldrons. The steppe was horrified. Jamaka had won the battle, but his cruelty cost him the war of reputation. Tribes that once supported him began to abandon him, drawn instead to Temüjin's vision of order and fairness. Slowly, steadily, Temüjin rose from defeat. He built his following not on tribal loyalty, but on merit. He broke apart traditional clans, mixing men from different backgrounds into the same military units, erasing the old lines of rivalry. What mattered was not blood but ability. What mattered was loyalty to him alone. By 1206, Temüjin had achieved what no one before him had dared to dream. The tribes of Mongolia, once fractured and endlessly feuding, stood united under his banner. At a great council, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The steppe was no longer a land of scattered clans. It was a single nation, forged in hunger, betrayal, and blood. And under its new master, it was about to erupt outward with a force that would shake the foundations of the known world. When Temüjin became Genghis Khan, he did not simply inherit an army, he created one. The warriors of the steppe had always been fierce, but under his hand they became something entirely new, a force unlike anything the world had ever faced. Other rulers relied on kinship, ancient bloodlines, and tradition. Genghis broke those traditions deliberately because he knew that to forge a true empire, he needed something stronger than family ties. He needed loyalty to him alone. Instead of organizing warriors by tribe, he dismantled the old structure. He broke apart the clans, scattering men who had once been rivals and placing them in the same units. At the heart of this system was the Arban, a squad of 10 men. 10 Arbans formed a company of 100, 10 companies formed a regiment of 1,000, and 10 regiments built a great army of 10,000, called a Tumen. It was simple, elegant, and erased the fragile webs of blood feud and alliance that had crippled the steppe for centuries. A man no longer fought because he shared blood with his leader. He fought because his place in the army demanded it, because his life and the lives of his brothers in arms depended on his obedience. And unlike so many rulers of his age, Genghis rewarded ability over noble birth. A herdsman who proved himself in battle could rise to command thousands. A boy born in obscurity might rise higher than an aristocrat if he had the skill, courage, and loyalty. This was revolutionary on the steppe, and it gave Genghis something priceless: the devotion of ambitious men who saw in him a path to power that had never existed before. But discipline was just as important as opportunity. Genghis demanded obedience, and he punished disobedience without hesitation. A soldier who deserted was executed. A warrior who abandoned his unit in battle brought death not only upon himself, but upon his entire 10-man squad. Entire groups were held accountable for one man's failure. Fear bound them, but so did trust, because they knew that their survival depended on one another. This ruthless system bred cohesion. It made the Mongol army behave not as scattered horsemen, but as a single, fluid organism. Their weapons, too, were unlike those of their enemies. The heart of the Mongol arsenal was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering made of wood, horn, and sinew, glued and bound together to create a weapon both small and deadly. Its compact shape allowed it to be used on horseback, yet it could send an arrow piercing through armor at 200 yards. A Mongol rider could loose 6 arrows in the time it took a European archer to loose one, and he could do it at a full gallop, guiding his horse with only the pressure of his knees. Each warrior carried multiple bows and quivers heavy with arrows tipped with iron or bone, designed to kill men, pierce armor, or bring down horses. Their horses were just as crucial. They were small, stocky, and seemingly unimpressive to outsiders, but incredibly hardy. They could survive on sparse grass, endure cold winters, and travel vast distances with little rest. Each warrior kept several horses and rotated between them, allowing him to ride day after day without exhausting his mount. On campaign, this meant the Mongols could cover 100 miles in a single day, a distance no European or Middle Eastern army could ever hope to match. Their mobility made them ghosts, appearing where no one expected them and vanishing before a counterattack could form. But weapons and horses alone did not make the Mongols invincible. It was their tactics, honed by Genghis himself, that set them apart. They mastered the art of deception. The feigned retreat became one of their deadliest strategies. An enemy would think the Mongols had broken and fled, and in their eagerness to chase, they would scatter their lines. Then, with terrifying precision, the Mongols would wheel around, surround their pursuers, and cut them down to the last man. Again and again, this trick succeeded, because their discipline allowed them to turn retreat into ambush with flawless timing. Terror was their other weapon. When a city resisted, the Mongols made an example of it. Entire populations were slaughtered, and survivors were sent fleeing to spread stories of horror. The next city, hearing the tales, often surrendered without a fight. Genghis understood that fear could conquer faster than any sword, and he wielded that fear like a blade sharper than steel. Yet at the same time, those who submitted quickly were often spared. Merchants, artisans, and skilled workers were valued, and religious freedom was granted. To resist was death. To surrender was survival. It was a simple, brutal equation, and it worked. The Mongols also built systems of communication that kept their vast empire connected. Genghis established a relay network of stations, each with fresh horses and riders ready to carry messages at astonishing speed. Orders could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, allowing the Khan to coordinate armies spread across entire continents. No other ruler of the age possessed such reach. All of this combined to create a war machine, the likes of which the world had never seen. The Mongols were fast, disciplined, adaptable, and terrifying. They could strike anywhere at any time, and no kingdom was too distant, no city too fortified, no army too large to escape their wrath. What had once been scattered tribes of herdsmen were now transformed into the most efficient military force in history, and at their head stood a man who had risen from hunger and slavery to command it all. The world beyond Mongolia was about to feel their fury. The Jin dynasty in China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, the princes of Russia, the knights of Hungary, all of them believed themselves secure behind their walls, armies, and traditions. None of them yet understood that a storm was gathering on the horizon, a storm that would sweep across half the earth, leaving empires shattered in its wake. When the tribes of Mongolia were finally bound into one nation under Genghis Khan, the horizon no longer seemed like a limit. To the south lay China, fractured between rival dynasties, rich with cities, grain, and treasures that the nomads of the steppe could scarcely imagine. To the west stretched the kingdoms of Central Asia, their caravan routes heavy with silk, spices, and silver. The world beyond Mongolia was filled with abundance, but it was also divided, distracted, and unprepared for the storm that was about to break. The first great test came against the Jin dynasty in northern China. For centuries, the sedentary kingdoms of China had looked down on the steppe peoples, dismissing them as barbarians. Walls had been built to keep them out, and armies sent to punish their raids. To the Jin, the Mongols were just another nuisance tribe, no different from those who had harassed their borders for generations. But in 1211, Genghis Khan gathered his armies, 100,000 horsemen, hardened by years of civil war and bound by unbreakable discipline, and pointed them south. The campaign was unlike anything the Jin had faced before. Chinese generals expected the Mongols to crash against their fortifications in wild, undisciplined charges. Instead, they met an enemy who moved with precision, who scouted every road, who feigned weakness only to spring ambushes that cut entire armies to pieces. The Mongols swept across the plains, bypassing fortified cities, devastating the countryside and cutting off supplies. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and the Jin armies forced into battles on open ground where their heavy infantry was no match for the mobility of the horse archers. One by one, cities fell. When the Mongols encircled a city, they constructed siege weapons on the spot: catapults, trebuchets, and siege towers, often built by Chinese and Persian engineers captured in earlier campaigns and spared precisely for this purpose. The Mongols were not just riders of the steppe. They absorbed the knowledge of those they conquered and used it against their enemies. Walls that had stood for centuries crumbled under the relentless assault. By 1215, the great Jin capital of Jiangdu, present-day Beijing, was under siege. Inside its walls, 1 million people huddled, starving as the Mongols cut off all supplies. Corpses piled up in the streets, disease spread, and desperation grew. When the city finally surrendered, the Mongols unleashed a fury that burned Jiangdu to the ground, its people slaughtered, its treasures carried north to Mongolia. The message was unmistakable. The age of Mongol raids was over. This was conquest. This was annihilation. Yet even as Genghis broke the power of the Jin, his gaze turned westward. Beyond the deserts and mountains lay the Horsemen Empire, a wealthy Muslim state controlling much of Persia and Central Asia. At first, Genghis did not ride to war. He sought trade. He sent a caravan of merchants, heavy with goods, to open relations. But the Shah of Horsemen, arrogant and suspicious, betrayed him. The caravan was seized, its goods stolen, and its men executed. When Genghis sent envoys to protest, one was killed and the others mutilated. It was a mistake that would doom an empire. In 1219, the Mongols descended upon Horsemen with fury. Genghis led 200,000 men across the desert, splitting his forces into multiple columns that moved like blades through the land. City after city fell in terror. At Bukhara, the gates were thrown open, and the Khan himself entered the great mosque. He mounted the pulpit where the imam once preached and declared to the terrified crowd, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The city was stripped, its defenders executed, and its artisans sent away to serve the Mongol war machine. At Samarkand, one of the jewels of Central Asia, the Mongols unleashed every weapon in their arsenal. Siege engines pounded the walls, sappers undermined the defenses, and waves of horsemen cut down those who dared sally forth. When the city fell, tens of thousands were killed, their bodies piled in pyramids outside the gates. Those spared were enslaved or scattered, their knowledge and skills absorbed into the growing empire. The Shah fled before the storm, abandoning his people and dying in exile. His empire dissolved behind him, cities reduced to ash, the Silk Road now firmly in Mongol hands. From the Aral Sea to the Hindu Kush, fire and death marked the passage of the Khan's armies. No force in the Islamic world could stop them. No alliance formed in time. In just a few years, a kingdom that had once commanded the riches of Persia ceased to exist. But it was not only conquest. The Mongols learned as they destroyed. Every campaign brought new engineers, artisans, and tactics. Persian siege engineers were absorbed into the Mongol ranks, their knowledge turned against the next fortress. Merchants were encouraged to travel, their caravans now protected under Mongol banners. Roads were cleared, bandits hunted down, and markets reopened under new rule. Trade flourished, even as cities burned. For those who resisted, the Mongols were destruction incarnate. For those who submitted, there was unexpected stability, even prosperity. Still, the scale of the slaughter was unlike anything the world had seen. Chroniclers in the Middle East wrote in horror of pyramids of skulls left behind where cities once stood. Refugees carried tales of fire and death across deserts and mountains. Panic spread as far as Baghdad and Damascus. To the rulers of Europe, the Mongols were still little more than rumors, barbarians fighting barbarians far away. But soon, those rumors would become a reality at their very gates. The storm had begun in China, rolled across Persia, and now gathered strength. From the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, the Mongols had carved an empire of fire and fear. And for the first time, the kingdoms of Europe and the caliphates of the Middle East began to realize that something unstoppable was moving in their direction. A force born on the steppe, led by a man whose name was already becoming legend. When the Khwarezmian Empire lay in ruins, its cities burned and its Shah a fugitive dying in exile, the Mongols did not stop to rest. Their armies pressed ever westward, testing the lands beyond the Caspian. Scouts rode through deserts and across mountains, mapping rivers and passes, sending word back to the Khan. To Genghis, knowledge was as vital as the bow or the sword. He understood that to conquer the world, he must first understand it. In 1220, his great general Subutai, the master of strategy, and Jebe, the fearless arrow of the Mongols, were ordered to push west, not to seize land but to scout, terrify, and bring back news of what lay beyond. With perhaps 20,000 men, they rode into the Caucasus, a storm of hooves sweeping across Armenia, Georgia, and into the steppes of the Rus. Wherever they went, cities fell in fire. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, they crushed a coalition of Russian princes and their steppe allies with deceptive brilliance. Pretending to flee, the Mongols drew their enemies into pursuit, then turned and annihilated them. Thousands were slaughtered, the princes themselves captured and executed beneath wooden boards, suffocated slowly as Mongol officers feasted upon the planks above them. To the Rus, the Mongols were a nightmare from nowhere, vanishing as quickly as they had come. Few realized that this was only a prelude, a test of Europe's defenses, a whisper of the storm to come. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire paused, torn by questions of succession. But the Mongols did not fracture. the sons of Genghis carried on his vision. By the 1230s, under the leadership of his successor Genghis Khan, the empire's gaze turned again to the west. This time it was no raid, no reconnaissance. This time it was conquest. The first target was the Rus. The Russian principalities were divided and endlessly feuding, their princes more concerned with their rivalries than with defense. One by one, the Mongols descended upon them. Ryazan was the first to fall, its walls smashed, its people slaughtered. Then Vladimir, then Moscow, then Kiev, each burned, each reduced to ash. Chroniclers wrote that the earth itself shook with the thunder of hooves, that fire consumed every wooden house, that churches collapsed under the weight of flames. The survivors spoke of entire populations slaughtered, of rivers choked with bodies, of silence where cities once stood. But the Mongols did not stop with Russia. They pressed further west, into Poland and Hungary, the very heart of Europe. In 1241, Subutai, now the supreme strategist of the Mongols, launched one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. He divided his armies into multiple columns, sending one north through Poland and another south through Hungary, coordinating their movements across hundreds of miles with astonishing precision. In Poland, Mongol horsemen descended like demons from the east. At the Battle of Legnica, a coalition of knights, peasants, and crusaders gathered under Duke Henry the Pious to resist them. The clash was fierce, steel against arrow, heavy cavalry charging against the swirling Mongol horsemen. But the knights found themselves outmaneuvered, drawn into chaos by feigned retreats, their formation shattered. Henry himself was killed, his head displayed on a spear, his army cut to pieces. The road into Poland lay open. At the same time, in Hungary, King Bela IV gathered a massive host of knights and peasants, tens of thousands strong, determined to stop the invaders at the river Sajo. The Mongols, led by Subutai, prepared their trap. On the night of April 10th, they crossed the river under cover of darkness, constructing a bridge and positioning themselves for battle. At dawn, the Hungarians believed they had the enemy trapped against the water, their knights eager for glory. But then the Mongols struck from all sides, their arrows raining down, their cavalry encircling. The Hungarian host was crushed, tens of thousands slaughtered in the chaos of the retreat. The Battle of Mohai was a catastrophe for Europe, a demonstration that even the strongest armies of Christendom were no match for the speed and cunning of the steppe horsemen. In the aftermath, the Mongols swept across Hungary, burning villages, leveling towns, and leaving behind nothing but smoke and silence. Chroniclers wrote that the land lay empty, its people slaughtered or scattered. Europe trembled. If Hungary could fall, if Poland could be shattered, then nothing stood between the Mongols and Vienna, and beyond Vienna, the heart of Germany, Italy, and France. The papacy in Rome heard whispers of horsemen who moved like the wind, of kingdoms collapsing in days. Panic spread across the continent. And then they vanished. Just as suddenly as they had come, the Mongols withdrew, pulling their armies back across the steppes and retreating east. To the stunned survivors of Europe, it seemed a miracle, a divine intervention saving Christendom from destruction. But the truth was more practical and far more ominous. In 1241, Genghis Khan had died in Mongolia, and all princes of Genghis blood were required to return for the Kurultai, the great council to elect a new supreme Khan. The fate of Europe had not been determined by the sword, but by politics in a distant land. Yet the memory lingered. In the ashes of Kiev, in the ruins of Hungarian villages, in the whispers of survivors, the name of the Mongols was carried like a curse. They had come as if from nowhere, burned a swath across the heart of Europe, and then departed as suddenly as they had arrived. To the people of the West, they seemed less like men and more like a scourge of God, a punishment from the heavens. And everyone knew they could return at any time. The Mongols were remembered in Europe as destroyers, horsemen of the apocalypse, the punishment of God. Yet destruction was not the whole story. Once the fire and bloodshed had passed, once resistance had been broken, something unexpected happened. Across the vast empire of the Mongols, from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, a new kind of order emerged. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was an age when, for perhaps the first time in history, most of the known world was connected under a single system. And while that system was born in terror, its results were extraordinary. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road flourished as never before. For centuries, the route that carried silk, spices, gold, and ideas between East and West had been dangerous, choked with bandits and disrupted by warring kingdoms. But now the Mongols cleared the roads, hunted the brigands, and guaranteed the safety of merchants. Caravans that once traveled in constant fear now moved under the protection of the Khan's authority. A merchant could set out from Venice and reach China, passing through thousands of miles of Mongol territory, and never once be robbed. In the eyes of traders, the empire that had begun with fire and sword had become a shield. Communication, too, was transformed. The Mongols established the yam, a relay system of postal stations that stretched like arteries across their empire. At every station, fresh horses and riders waited, ready to carry messages at astonishing speed. Orders from the Khan could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, far faster than any other power of the age. What began as a tool of war became the foundation of administration, binding together the farthest corners of the empire. And with this new stability came exchange, not only of goods but of knowledge. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, paper money, and printing spread westward, carried on Mongol roads and ships. Islamic astronomy and mathematics traveled east. Medical knowledge, artistic styles, languages, and religions flowed across borders that had once been barriers. The Mongols, brutal as they were, did not impose a single faith or culture. They allowed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and countless other traditions to exist side by side. In their own court, shamans stood alongside imams, priests, and monks. For artisans, scholars, and traders, this was an empire of opportunity. One of the most famous travelers of this age was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who journeyed east in the late 13th century. Through his eyes, Europe glimpsed the wonders of China, cities larger than anything in the West, paper money used in daily trade, gunpowder weapons, and silk and porcelain in endless abundance. To his readers back home, his tales seemed fantastical, almost unbelievable. Yet they were made possible only because the Mongols had opened the road. Without the empire of the Khans, the Venetian would never have crossed so far into Asia, nor returned alive to tell the tale. But the Pax Mongolica was not simply about exchange. It was also about power, and the delicate balance of terror and order that sustained it. The peace endured only because no one dared resist. Cities remembered what had happened to those who defied Mongol armies. Kingdoms knew that rebellion meant annihilation. It was peace, yes, but peace enforced by fear. Still, for ordinary merchants, pilgrims, and travelers, it must have seemed miraculous. A man could ride across half the world with a handful of silver and return with silk, spices, and stories. For a brief time, the world was stitched together by horsemen who had once seemed to be nothing but destroyers. Yet this great web carried more than silk and ideas. It also carried death. Along with caravans and merchants came rats, and with rats, fleas, and with fleas, plague. The Black Death, which swept across Eurasia in the 14th century, killing tens of millions, traveled the very roads that the Mongols had made safe. In the same way they had opened the world to trade and connection, they had also opened the path for one of the deadliest pandemics in history. The empire had made the world smaller, but it also made it more vulnerable. Still, the Pax Mongolica remains one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in human history. The same empire that burned Zhengdu and Samarkand, that slaughtered entire populations in Kiev and Hungary, also created the conditions for a connected world centuries before globalization. They were conquerors and destroyers, but also unifiers and facilitators. The Mongol Empire was not just a story of conquest. It was a story of transformation. And yet nothing lasts forever. The very empire that brought peace to so much of the known world began to fracture, torn by the same forces that had once destroyed the steppe tribes before Genghis Khan. Succession disputes, rival ambitions, and the sheer size of the empire made unity impossible. The Pax Mongolica would not endure. For decades, the Mongol Empire seemed invincible. It had swept across Asia, crushed Persia, burned Russia, terrified Europe, and even brought mighty China to its knees. Under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors, it had become the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever known. But even the greatest storms fade, and the Mongol Empire, like Rome before it, would discover that conquest was easier than keeping what was conquered. The heart of the problem was succession. Genghis Khan had built his empire not on institutions or written laws, but on loyalty to himself. His charisma, his ruthless authority, and his vision had bound the tribes together and carried them across continents. But when he died in 1227, that bond was broken. His chosen successor, his son Ojde, continued the conquests, pushing into Russia, Persia, and Hungary, but the cracks were already there. Each son, grandson, and branch of the family believed they had a claim, and ambition soon gnawed at unity. The empire was too vast, stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the deserts of Arabia. No single ruler could possibly govern it all. Even with the YAM system of messengers, orders took weeks or months to reach distant fronts. Generals acted on their own, governors sought independence, and family rivalries turned into bitter feuds. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had fractured into four great khanates. In the east was the Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis. Kublai was not only a conqueror but a ruler of vision, determined to govern China not merely as a nomadic overlord, but as an emperor in the Chinese tradition. He built a capital at Khanbalik, today's Beijing, and declared himself the son of heaven. Under him, the Mongols became not just horsemen of the steppe, but rulers of one of the richest civilizations on earth. To the west lay the Ilkhanate, stretching across Persia and into the Middle East. Here, the Mongols ruled over ancient cities like Baghdad and Tabriz, eventually absorbing Persian culture, converting to Islam, and blending their steppe traditions with the rich heritage of the Islamic world. For a time, it seemed as if the Ilkhanate might become a bridge between East and West, a fusion of Mongol power with Persian sophistication. In Central Asia lay the Chagatai Khanate, named for another son of Genghis. This was a realm of steppes and mountains, a land of shifting power where tribal traditions remained strong and the old ways of nomadic rule persisted. It was perhaps the most unstable of the Khanates, often torn between competing factions, yet it remained a crucial link in the chain of Mongol dominion. And in the north, stretching across the forests and rivers of Russia and into the grasslands of the steppe, was the Golden Horde. From their camps along the Volga, the Mongols ruled the Russian principalities with an iron hand, demanding tribute and sending their riders to enforce obedience, but rarely intervening directly in governance. For centuries, the princes of Moscow and Kiev bowed before the Khans of the Golden Horde, their independence reduced to a shadow. It was here, in the frozen lands of the north, that the Mongol legacy would linger the longest, shaping the destiny of Russia for generations to come. Each Khanate remained formidable. Each still carried the memory of Genghis Khan's wrath. But the unity was gone. No single voice commanded the obedience of all Mongols. The great Kurultais became arenas of rivalry, where cousins and brothers argued, schemed, and fought. Wars broke out not only against enemies abroad, but between Mongols themselves. And as the unity fractured, so too did the aura of invincibility. Enemies who once trembled now saw weakness. In the Middle East, the Mamluks of Egypt struck back, halting Mongol expansion at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first great Mongol defeat on open ground. In Japan, the great fleets of Kublai Khan, thousands of ships carrying warriors across the sea, were shattered by typhoons the Japanese would call the kamikaze, the divine wind. In the deserts of Persia, rebellion smoldered. In Russia, resistance hardened. In China, corruption began to fester in the Mongol court. What had seemed eternal began to erode. The empire did not collapse overnight. It would linger in pieces for centuries. But the age of unstoppable conquest was over. The world no longer saw the Mongols as invincible. They were still feared, still powerful, but no longer united. And yet, even in fragmentation, their shadow stretched far. The Golden Horde dominated Russia for centuries, shaping its politics and centralizing its rulers. The Yuan dynasty ruled China until the rise of the Ming. The Ilkhanate helped spread Islam deeper into Asia. The Chagatai Khanate became a crucible from which new conquerors, like Tamerlane, would later emerge. The empire of Genghis Khan had shattered, but its fragments still carried his legacy, reshaping the world in their own ways. The storm had broken apart, its winds scattering in every direction, but the echoes of its power, the memory of its terror, and the structures it left behind, ensured that the Mongol Empire never truly vanished. It changed, splintered, and adapted. And through those fragments, its influence reached far beyond its own age. The Mongol Empire fractured, but its shadow never disappeared. Though the unity of Genghis Khan's vision was gone, the impact of his conquests rippled across continents, shaping nations, ideas, and the course of history itself. For centuries after their decline, the world still lived in the echo of Mongol thunder. Perhaps their greatest legacy was in war itself. Before the Mongols, armies moved slowly, chained to supply lines and weighed down by heavy infantry. The Mongols transformed warfare into something fluid, mobile, and terrifying. They perfected cavalry tactics that would inspire armies for generations. Their use of feigned retreats and coordinated strikes studied even by modern strategists. They showed that speed and discipline could defeat numbers, that terror could conquer faster than the sword, and that merit could build stronger armies than bloodlines. From the knights of Europe to the sultans of the Middle East, every power that survived adapted, learning lessons carved into them by defeat. But the Mongols were not only destroyers. They were also builders of connections. The Silk Road, once fractured by constant war, became a lifeline of trade. Under their watch, caravans carried silk, spices, porcelain, glass, and precious metals across thousands of miles. Ideas traveled with them, mathematics and astronomy from the Islamic world to China, papermaking and printing from China to the West. Religions crossed freely. Nestorian Christians found refuge in Mongol courts, while Muslims and Buddhists debated philosophy under the Khan's protection. In their brutal way, the Mongols created the first truly global network. They also left behind political legacies. In Russia, Mongol domination forced the fragmented principalities into centralization. Moscow rose as a power in part because it learned to collect tribute for the horde, building the systems that would later make it an empire in its own right. In China, the Yuan dynasty reshaped the imperial system, leaving behind structures and roads that endured long after the Mongols were gone. In Persia, the Ilkhanate blended Mongol and Islamic traditions, accelerating the spread of Islam deeper into Asia and leaving behind a fusion of cultures that shaped the region's future. And in ways no one could have predicted, the Mongols altered the very demographics of the world. The Black Death, carried along their reopened trade routes, devastated populations from China to Europe, killing tens of millions. It shattered feudal systems in Europe, destabilized dynasties in Asia, and reshaped economies in ways that historians still trace today. The very roads that carried silk and ideas also carried plague, a reminder that connection brings not only prosperity but vulnerability. Even in legend, the Mongols endure. To some, they were monsters, destroyers who left nothing but ashes. To others, they were visionaries, a people who opened the world and forced humanity into new contact. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan remains a national hero, his face on currency, his name invoked with pride. In the West, he is remembered with awe and fear, a symbol of barbarian conquest. His name, centuries later, still carries weight, perhaps the most famous conqueror in all of history. Their legacy is a paradox. They killed more people than perhaps any empire before them, yet they made trade and communication flourish. They burned cities to the ground, yet they built an empire of roads and relays that stitched the world together. They were ruthless but also pragmatic, tolerant of religions, appreciative of artisans, and eager to learn from those they conquered. They were the most feared empire of the Middle Ages, yet they also laid foundations that would help create the modern age. In the end, their greatest legacy may not be in the ruins they left, nor the treasures they carried away, but in the simple fact that they proved the world was not so large, not so separate, not so safe in its divisions. They forced Europe, the Islamic world, India, and China into contact. They created the conditions for exchange, for devastation, for renewal. They reminded humanity that isolation is an illusion, that the fate of one people can sweep across oceans and deserts to touch the lives of millions. The Mongols did not conquer forever. No empire does. but in their brief, blazing age, they reshaped the earth. And long after their khanates had fallen, long after their riders had vanished from the steppes of Europe and the deserts of Persia, the world still lived in their shadow. On the vast grasslands of Mongolia, the wind still whispers across the steppe. It is the same wind that once carried the thunder of hooves, the clash of arrows, the cries of conquest. Today, it blows through empty plains and lonely mountains, but once, it carried the sound of the most fearsome army the world had ever known. The Mongol Empire rose from nothing, from an abandoned boy with no tribe, no wealth, and no future came a force that shattered kingdoms and humbled empires. Genghis Khan transformed exile into leadership, betrayal into discipline, and hunger into power. In less than a lifetime, he and his descendants redrew the map of the known world. They brought terror and ruin, yes. Cities burned to ash, populations massacred, monuments toppled. But they also brought order where there had been chaos, connection where there had been isolation. They carved open the arteries of the Silk Road, moved goods and ideas across continents, and forced civilizations to reckon with one another in ways that had never happened before. For 2 centuries, the echo of Mongol hooves dominated Eurasia. And though the empire eventually fractured, though its khanates fell one by one, its impact never truly ended. The way wars are fought, the way empires govern, the way trade flows across continents, all bear the imprint of the Mongols. Even the tragedies they unleashed, like the Black Death, reshaped humanity forever. And so, their legacy endures. Not in the ruins of Samarkand or the ashes of Kiev, but in the simple fact that they revealed how fragile the world's borders truly are, how swiftly a force from the margins can rise and sweep across civilizations that believe themselves secure. The Mongols were not a footnote in history. They were a turning point. The storm has passed, but its memory remains. In the silence of the steppe, where the horizon stretches unbroken, one can almost hear it still. The faint, distant rumble of hooves, the ghost of a world once conquered, and the shadow of a man whose name still carries across centuries: Genghis Khan.